I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest news from across the battlefront, focusing on the Donbass, and we ask whether there are some positives Ukraine can take from the situation. And I discover how a team of Ukrainians' passion for whiskey is being used to raise money for the army.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 27th of May, day 93. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Dominic Nicholls, Assistant Foreign Editor, Venetia Rainey, and Mutaz Ahmed from our comment team. I started by asking Dom and Venetia for the latest news from Ukraine.
Hi, David. Hi, everybody. It's been focused on the Donbass region as expected. Still a lot of hard fighting going on in that pocket around Severodonetsk. Not a huge amount of change to the front lines there. Russia still pushing west with some very, very limited success, but it is moving forward. It is advancing. Yet to close the pocket, and Ukrainian forces are still able to be reinforced through the main roads in that area. You may remember Roland, our colleague Roland Oliphant, who came to us live yesterday. He was talking about the exact geography of the area. So it is tricky to completely cut off any of those reinforcing routes, but that does seem to be the way that Russian forces are going. In fact, Roland's got an article online now that's live. It's in front of the paywall. If anybody wants to catch up with what Roland's saying, it's very, very interesting there. But still a lot of hard fighting going on there. There was a Pentagon briefing last night. Just to bring everyone up to speed in terms of the weapon supplies, because Ukraine are calling for much heavier weapons to go in, and the Pentagon spokesman was giving some details on that. So just to bring everyone up to speed. So US have supplied more than 85 of the 108 promised M777 howitzers, these big 155mm howitzers, and of the 208,000 rounds of ammunition that's been promised, they've supplied 190,000. So a huge amount of ammunition in there, and it looks like the M777s are all virtually all in country. And the Pentagon spokesman said that they're not hanging around in warehouses and storage facilities and training facilities. The training's been done outside the country. These weapons, when they go into the country, into Ukraine, are pushed forward straight away. So they are there in some numbers and up the front. They also said that 9 of the 11 Mi-17, the big transport aircraft, the helicopters, the derivative of the Mi-8, the HIP, are in theatre. The additional 2 will be either later in June or early July. And finally said of the Switchblade 300s, these loitering munitions, said 230 have been gifted to Ukraine, and that makes 73% of the total offer from the US. Now, I'm gonna have to take my shoes and socks off to work it out, but I don't know what 220 being 73%. You're looking at about an extra 50 or so on top of that. But the maths genius out there will be able to work that out exactly. But a lot of Switchblade munitions, a lot of munitions in total. And also said that Russia has 110 battalion tactical groups left in Ukraine. The majority of them, they're pretty evenly spread out across the country, but the biggest proportion is in the centre in this fight for the Donbass. But I'll take a pause there.
Thanks, Dom. Venetia, what else should we be paying attention to today?
Yeah, well, I think as Dom says, it's really still all about the Donbass. That's where the active front is at the moment. We've seen still lots of really fierce fighting, and the Ukrainians basically copping to the fact that it's not going as well for them as the war has gone in other areas. And Dom wrote a very interesting piece, which he can tell you about shortly, about why that's actually a good thing that they're admitting some of this stuff. But essentially, we had, Ukrainian general staff yesterday saying that they might have to retreat in some areas, that it's about winning the war, not the battle. They're being pushed back around these key towns that we've been following, Lyshansk and Severodonetsk. We also had Zelensky saying in his nightly address that Russia is determined to reduce these cities to ashes and that it wants to make the Donbass uninhabited. So really this sense that there's quite apocalyptic fighting going on in this eastern region, which we sort of took our eyes off a bit during much of the beginning of the war. It was already controlled or sort of fought over since 2014, and parts of it were already controlled by Russian separatists. It really felt like the biggest gains for Russia were to be made around Kiev or Kharkiv or in the south of Mariupol. But obviously we've seen them retreat from around Kiev and Kharkiv. The Russians have taken Mariupol, and now they're trying to consolidate the sort of separatist gains in the Donbass, and that might be what Russia may eventually end up settling for. That might be the big victory that they're hoping to get out of this war. So it's definitely one to watch closely. And it's interesting that the Ukrainians are being pushed back. Russia is definitely throwing everything that it has now at this bit of fighting. We've seen sort of soldiers redeployed from Mariupol, which isn't a great sign because these soldiers are likely to be very tired. And we've also heard in an MOD briefing this morning, and again, Dom can tell you a bit more about this in a second, that Russia has been sending in T-62 tanks, very old tanks, 50-something-year-old tanks, into the battle in the Donbass, which shows that perhaps their war cupboard is looking increasingly bare.
Thanks, Venetia. Well, Dom, do you want to come in on that? What did the MOD say today?
Well, I mean, rather delightfully, the MOD just said what we've been discussing over the last few days. These T-62 tanks, which, as Venetia says, designed in the 50s actually, in service, brought in service through the 60s up to the T-72. The T-72 took over from it as the sort of mainstay of the then Soviet Union, now Russia's tank force. But Russia has thousands of T-62 in storage. Some of that storage is good undercover when it's maintained, and some storage is just out in the open, so completely exposed to the elements, and so it's not going to survive well there. So a number of points about this. Firstly, not great from a Ukrainian point of view that Russia has got this huge backlog of or this huge reserve of tanks that it can draw upon. However, what state are they likely to be in? Not great if a lot of them have been left out in the elements for decades. How many spare parts are there? I don't know if the Russian supply system still makes an axle and a track grouser spud and all the rest of it for a T-62 tank. So how supportable are they? And also T-62 or 115 millimeter caliber. That's the caliber. That's the width of the round. So obviously the length of it is longer than that, but that's the width. 115 is that's going to make your eyes water if one of those lands at your feet. But the point is that the rest of the Russian tanks, the 72s, the 80s, and the 90s, are 125 millimeter caliber. Not massively bigger. It all matters, but they're not hugely bigger. But think about the logistic burden. If you are, as we've already seen, the logistic chain for Russia has been stretched. Ukraine have been very, very good at being able to hit those logistic corridors, hit the fuel, hit the ammunition, hit all the other things that you need to keep a military force going. So it's under strain. They've lost hundreds of trucks, just the bog standard trucks, to carry all this stuff around. Russia's lost loads of them. So just moving this stuff about is problematic. And if you then say to the logistician, right, well, here's a completely different nature of equipment, different caliber ammunition, old spare parts, you can't sort of cannibalize much of the stuff from a T-72, 80 or 90 for a T-62. It's just a logistician's nightmare to say, oh, those tanks over there, or those tanks that were there yesterday, they need all this stuff. The T-62s over there need some of this other stuff, but in the fog of war and with battle, everything moves about a bit and you kind of lose track of what's where. It's a nightmare. So if you have what's called mixed fleets, so different types of generally the same piece of equipment. So if you have, it'd be nice if all the tanks were the same, and it doesn't matter where all the spare track wheels go and all the rest of it, and the running gear and blah blah blah, whatever else. But if you've got to then try and cater for a completely different nature of equipment, it's just a nightmare. So yes, it is significant that Russia are able to lean on all these extra tanks. Got to ask the question why they're having to reach back for these 62s. It's because they are losing so many other vehicles, all the more modern tanks on the battlefield. They're old. They're probably not very well supported. It might be not my place to say, but it might be a waste of a javelin or an NLAW to try and kill a T-62. I would have thought some of the older anti-tank munitions, maybe even an RPG, the rocket-propelled grenade, would have a serious impact on these things. So they're very old pieces of equipment. And as we mentioned in the last couple of days, who's going to be crewing them? Because generally, if you knock out a tank with one of these modern anti-tank missiles, the crew are dead. There's no one getting out of it unless the thing's broken down and the crew have run off. But the majority of the tanks they've lost have been destroyed, and that will include the crew. So the crews of these new T-62 are going to be younger, new, might be conscripts. How good are they? How much do they know their vehicle, let alone how to fight the battle alongside everything else? So, yeah, T-62 is going into the fight, probably in the southern area. That was the MOD, British MOD Defence Intelligence Assessment, going into the southern region, so north of Crimea, along the coast, that area there that Russia has taken, so from sort of Kherson up to Mariupol and through into the Donbass. That's probably where the T-62s are going. They might be used for rear area security to free up other tanks to go forward. So it's not. I'm not saying just because T-62s are going in, they're all going to be knocked out very quickly. That war doesn't work that way. It's never so clear. But in and of itself, it's not an unalloyed win for Russia on that one.
Thanks, Dom. Venetia, I realise we don't have you for very long. What other updates do you think our listeners should be aware of? And would you like to talk a little bit about what Roland Oliphant, our correspondent out in the Donbass, has found in his latest dispatch?
Talking more about the fighting going on in these key cities and the sort of road out to Kramatorsk and the battle for these very last stretches of land in the Donbass, which is a lot of what we've been talking about this week, and the listeners will be increasingly familiar with it. But it's a very good story talking about from a very personal perspective. Getting into the dugout with Ukrainian soldiers and how they're listening out for the sounds of shells, and that they increasingly know, not through any kind of use of fancy technology, but just by using their ears and their spider senses, whether a shell is coming towards them, whether it's coming near, whether it was a purposeful hit or not. Roland's obviously been on the ground for us. This is his second time he's being deployed out to Ukraine for us, and his writing is absolutely fantastic. So I would definitely recommend all of our listeners go and read that. As Dom said, it's on our front page at the moment and free to read. One other thing I wanted to talk about was this story about more than 100 guards in Russia having their sacking confirmed by a Russian court. That sounds a bit technical, but we've been hearing about lots of cases of soldiers or National Guards in Russia refusing to go and fight in Ukraine, saying we're not full-blown Russian army soldiers, we're in the National Guard, which is a kind of domestic service, and it's not our job to go and fight in Ukraine. Some of them have hired lawyers to try and press their case, and some have just been sacked and have tried to appeal the sacking. Yesterday was the first time that we heard from a sort of official Russian state source, if you like, that these cases are going on. We've heard previously from activist groups, from lawyers on social media, but this case confirmed that 115 National Guards are being sacked for refusing to fight in Ukraine. And that's pretty extraordinary. The Russian state has very much tried to pretend that everyone is on board with what they call their special military operation, that people are coming back intact and that there's no dissent over the war at all. But this really goes to show that even people who, clearly are relatively patriotic and serve for state institutions, which the National Guard is one, but they don't agree with the war enough to go and fight in it, to lay their life on the line for it. So I think that's a pretty significant story and part of the sort of resistance in Russia theme that we've been following throughout the war.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Venetia. Mutaz, Ahmed, can we bring you in here? You've been listening to these updates. What's your take on it? What's the latest from what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think for many sort of course, Venetia and Dom are following this daily, and so this won't be new to them. But this new theme in the war of Russia making pretty solid advances in the Donbass has come as a jolt to a lot of European capitals. For much of the war, Western leaders and Western policymakers have had the comfort of knowing that the Ukrainians were succeeding and not just defending themselves, but pushing back and even pushing back old boundaries. And that sort of that comfort plastered over any sort of divisions over strategy between the EU and America or within NATO. But it's being peeled back now because the war is evolving, especially in the Donbass, and not in Ukraine's favor. And so all these questions about Germany not sending as many weapons as other European countries, about Macron speaking the language of concessions and conciliation, all these tensions are coming back to the fore with a higher ferocity. And now there is a new sort of urgency when it comes to decisions about how to help Ukraine. So you've got the United States and today Boris Johnson talking about sending multiple rocket launch systems and increasingly offensive weapons, and sending them quickly, while Germany's Chancellor Scholz and Macron continue to sort of be the laggards, and we saw Scholz criticised over his speeches at Davos this week. So effectively, what this new development has done is to make the disagreements within the Western Alliance more pertinent, and I think you'll see over the coming days they will become more explicit, and amongst commentators they will become angrier. You'll see much angrier calls for Germany and France to do more, and indeed for Britain and America to do even more than they already have.
Thanks, Mutaz. Just one last thing from Venetia. 2 more Russian servicemen have gone on trial in Ukraine. Can you tell us about this? What are they being tried with? What's happening?
Yeah, so we've seen a sort of number of trials of Russian citizens in Ukraine related to crimes that they've committed during the war. I know we spoke last week, maybe the week before, about the first one, about this guy who shot an unarmed civilian who was cycling along on a bicycle on his way home, and he just pointed his gun out the window and shot him dead after being told to by his commander. There are more trials going on. The latest is these 2 men who were on trial for shelling a town in the Kharkiv region, and they've acknowledged that they were part of an artillery unit that was firing at this town, and they're now facing up to 12 years in jail. Defence lawyers argued that they should be given leniency because they were just following orders, and this sort of tucks back into this issue that I know we spoke about after the first trial, and is following orders enough of a defence? This is just the sort of latest in a number of trials that will be happening in Ukraine, it'll be interesting to see what happens and whether they start to lose momentum or how Russia reacts as well.
Thank you very much, Venetia. Dom Nicholls, you've written some analysis for The Telegraph today. You write that there's been an outbreak of bad news from Ukraine in recent days. I mean, if our listeners listen to us daily, listen to the podcast, they'll realise that. But you write that this is to be welcomed. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm talking about the honesty and the moral core that is required to see any military action through the long haul. So I'm pointing to the comments coming out from President Zelensky and his senior advisors, such as they're saying we are barely afloat in the Donbass, and President Zelensky is talking about the annihilation and the genocide. He's used the word genocide of the region. I mean, these are very, very evocative and powerful terms, and in a way, I think it is to be applauded, this level of honesty. If you have an undiluted diet of good news and victories, not only does it, on the one hand, I think it can allow a level of complacency to creep in, both domestically and also internationally. There are already calls for people saying, why are we supplying weapons and money to Ukraine when we've got our own problems on our own doorstep? So the more, if there was this narrative of this, well, the Russians are being rolled up, it's only a matter of time before it's all goes to negotiations and it's all over, then there'll be greater calls for, well, we don't need to spend any more money, we don't need to spend more gifting weapons to Ukraine. So I think you could undermine your case by trying to be unrelentingly positive. And secondly, it just undermines the speaker. If you look at how Vladimir Putin is using strategic communications, then I mean, they're either sort of not saying anything, and just denying or denying the facts that are able to creep into Russia through the internet and what have you, or they're just putting out really great distortions of the truth. So you just don't. unless you've absolutely been hardwired to believe what the leadership are saying, you just don't believe anything that's coming out of the Kremlin, and that itself is a problem. And I just contrast this with what we experienced in this country throughout Iraq and Afghanistan. And I was saying how there was a lot of good news, basically, certainly fed to us in the military. It was all we're just on the cusp of victory, or one last push. And as I've written today, one of the last comments that were ringing in my very doubting ears as I left for Afghanistan was, there are grounds for cautious optimism. It's like, oh, bloody hell! I mean, I don't know what the grounds were, and I hope the caution was quite extreme. But if you just say everything's going fine, it's all going fine, not only it just sort of saps the will to believe what you're being fed, but also when you do have a setback, then it can absolutely rock you to the core. And so I think President Zelensky and his team have been very astute here to prepare their country and the international community for setbacks. I mean, it's war, right? They're up against Russia. We've talked about the many problems Russia have had, but I mean, they are achieving some measure of success, and where they're not succeeding, they are causing a huge amount of damage and carnage around the country. So they're a hugely powerful organisation, even if they're not achieving many or any of their big war aims. And so there will be setbacks in this war, however it's going to turn out. And it's right to prepare the citizens for the long term. It's right to be honest with your soldiers if you want them to fight for maybe years, if certainly not months. And so I think this is fairly clever communication. If you think about the British experience in the Second World War, firstly, Dunkirk, many people sort of saw that as that's a fantastic, great moment, almost a battle honour. So no, that was a defeat. And Churchill was right when he said thanks for the deliverance. We should be thankful for the deliverance from Dunkirk, but victories are not made of glorious retreats. And then in 1942, when the Allies finally prevailed over the Germans and the Axis forces in North Africa, again it was sort of lauded as a massive victory, and it was. Okay, you got to have a brief moment for a pat on the back, but again, Churchill was just there to dampen things down a little bit, and he said, look, this is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. So there's some very, very clever ways of being able to say, yeah, you've done a good job, but we're in this for the long haul. And I think it's just as much as you should celebrate your successes, you need to be honest with your people and your fighters and the international community when things are not going that well, if you want to maintain credibility. And I think the one thing that President Zelensky and his team have been very good at throughout this whole war is that level of credibility. You know who he is. There doesn't seem to be a lot of gloss, not a lot of spin. I mean, he's cutting around in his t-shirts and what have you, and he's talking to you, he's talking to us as a Ukrainian citizen who happens to be president, rather than the other way around. Very different comms to what we see from the Kremlin. So yes, this is bad news. We've talked about it at length. I mean, the Severodonetsk pocket is not closed yet. We should absolutely reiterate that this is not yet a defeat. But if you think about what Russia tried to do 3 months ago, there was going to be this lightning advance, 72 hours, Kyiv overtaken, job done. Then apparently it all became the Donbass, and there was going to be this sweeping move south of Kharkiv, north of Mariupol, and it'll all be sewn up fairly quickly. And now we're talking about a very small pocket in eastern Ukraine. I mean, it's valuable, and there are people being killed in there right now. So we shouldn't be too glib about it. We shouldn't be glib at all about it. But this looks like it's going to be a small tactical victory for Russia. They've not really been able to knit those victories together to make any kind of operational advance or anything on a grand strategic scale. So, yeah, we should be cautious about what this actually means. And I think it's been very, very clever comms from the Ukrainian side to prepare their population for a likely setback.
Thank you very much, Dom. Mutaz, do you want to come in on that? As somebody, I think it was interesting earlier when you said, we've been covering this daily. You've been standing a little bit further away. What do you take from Dom's analysis there?
I think he's right. We had Charles Moore right a few days ago about the need for Ukraine to be more transparent about casualties, and it's understandable when governments are leading countries in a state of war, that they might want to withhold some information to keep morale high. But morale is high in Ukraine to such an extent that the government in Kiev has more leeway to sort of to be more transparent, and by being transparent, it appears more virtuous. So it's also a very smart sort of communications move. But I think it reflects, the big thing for me is that Russia is now making progress in the Donbass, and there is the very real possibility that at some point in coming weeks, Putin will have an opportunity to declare some sort of victory, whether it be by taking the district of Luhansk or whatever it may be. There is an opportunity there, and so this messaging from Zelensky reflects that this is a crunch point, right? It might be possible to turn it round, but only if the West sort of doubles down and sends lots and lots of equipment. That's just the reality. And he made a very interesting point this week, Zelensky, about brute force. If Putin is allowed to declare any sort of victory, it will be a victory for brute force. And any victory for brute force becomes an incentive for brute force in the future. So there is a very real interest for the West to prevent any kind of victory for Putin, which is why you see that this not panic but renewed urgency from London and Washington to make sure he doesn't get that victory. I'm not sure how possible it is now to prevent Russia from encircling certain cities in the Donbass, but what we can see is this renewed effort from the West. Hopefully, this time bringing along Germany and France much more closely than before.
Mutaz, on the comment desk, you're talking to politicians, policymakers all the time. What's the latest from them? What's the feeling you get about how the British establishment are viewing the war?
Well, there's some distraction at the moment, understandable distraction over Partygate. So it hasn't been at the forefront of the agenda, I'm afraid, over the last couple of weeks. But we're seeing it in Westminster a lot now through the consequences, right? There's a lot of thought going into the food crisis, the international food crisis, and there's a hell of a lot of thought going into inflation, and a lot of concern about how the Ukraine war, how a prolonged war will affect inflation in the UK, and that, in some sense, has reduced the appetite for any kind of war, and this was entirely predictable. But as the consequences of war in Europe plays out in the oil markets and in our inflation rate and in our food prices, the interest is going to move away from what happens on the battlefield day to day to the broader sort of image, and that lends itself to talk of negotiations and so on. But there is still a very solid commitment to, making sure Putin doesn't win. There's a sort of cast iron feeling, especially in Westminster, that this is almost a moral project. That the UK has to do everything it can, regardless of the price we're currently paying, and that's regrettable. But there's an acknowledgement that we're paying a price. The British people are. That the UK still has to do everything it can to help defend Ukraine. And there's increasing frustration, I have to say, with comments emanating from people like Henry Kissinger at Davos about trading territory, and the sort of language emanating from the Elysee, publicly sort of projecting what kind of, how the negotiations might play out. Everyone knows this will likely end in a settlement. But there's still this horror in Westminster at Western leaders sort of projecting beforehand how it should go, because there's a feeling that reduces Ukraine's hand. It reduces their leverage if it's predictable what the West will, what kind of price that the West is willing to pay.
Thanks, Mutaz. Dom, I know you wanted to come in on a few of those things.
Well, I was just going to make the point that Mutaz raised the suggestion that after this anticipated victory in this portion of the Donbass, that Putin might then seek to go into negotiations with a strong hand. I mean, that is entirely possible, but we should also look at what happened before, when Russian forces were ejected from the north of the country, and they then said, "Oh, actually, the main objective all along has been the Donbass, so we're going to go around there." And it was all a feint to Kyiv. We were never that serious. I don't think many people believed that, but what the analysis was at the time was that to have any meaningful impact, the forces that came out of the north of the country then needed about 5 or 6 weeks of reconstitution, which, as we've discussed many times, is not only resting your people and your equipment, fixing your people and equipment, but also reorganizing your structures for the fight that's revealed itself to you. And we were questioning whether or not there would be this 5 or 6 week period before things really got going in the Donbass, or whether Russia would just sort of rush in and try and gain a victory. At the time, we were talking about maybe they want a victory before the May the 9th Victory Day parade. And they did. They rushed in, and they got badly mauled in the last few weeks, certainly to the north and to the northeast of Kharkiv. And it's only been in the last couple of weeks, which is about the timescale that people were saying for a proper reconstituted force to go in. That's when Russia's been able to start knitting together these small tactical successes. Combined with this, you may remember these reports that Putin and Valery Gerasimov, the head of the entire Russian armed forces, had been meddling down the chain of command, had been sort of tactically directing groupings down to around about brigade level. We were told by Western officials that it was down to the level that would normally be expected a colonel or brigadier to operate at. So, a very, very, actually, in the grand scheme of things, quite low down the chain of command. And I just wonder if there is a victory here in the eastern Donbass, or in the Luhansk Oblast of the Donbass for Russia, whether or not the military will turn around and say, right, we now need to pause, to take breath, to have another few weeks to properly reconstitute before pushing on either north back to Kharkiv or try and continue south. Maybe there's this vaunted aim to get through to Odessa, or just keep going west to the Dnieper River. And I just wonder if at that point we'll see this push again from supposedly from the Kremlin, say no, go straight away, push west, in which case they will become rapidly unstuck again. So I think if there is this victory in the Donbass, we will see very quickly whether Russia just stick to that old model of just keep going, just push on, and they will lose an awful lot of troops doing that, or whether or not General Dvornikov, the Russian commander put in charge of the overall theatre, he was put in place after the forces were ejected from the north. Whether or not he's able to wield any influence to say no, I need a proper 3 or 4 weeks to get my army ready to go again. So there will be, or there should be, a pause if Russia is successful in the next week or so, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not that is the case, whether or not that transitions into some calls for negotiations, or whether they just keep going and show yet again that they didn't learn from their previous experience.
Dom, can I ask quickly? We've heard a lot about what the Ukrainians have been asking for, and there's, as we've discussed, a lot of urgency now in their calls for more ammunition, more weapons. Zelensky said specifically that they would like long-range multiple-launch rocket systems. Could we just dig into that? Why exactly those systems? What do they do, and what advantage would that give the Ukrainians?
Range and precision, basically. So these multiple launch rocket systems, the HIMARS that's in service with the US and a few other places, there's talk that will be the next nature of equipment that is sent. The Pentagon spokesman last night was very, very clear that they didn't know, or made very good face of it, very good fist of saying he didn't know what was going to be in the next presidential aid package, or the next package that Biden would take for clearance through the US. But HIMARS is this, oh God, forgive me, but it's a multiple launch rocket system, big artillery system, range in the sort of 180 miles, 300 Ks. You can either fire a missile, fire a bank of 6 missiles, or one very long range, basically a ballistic missile. And so you're talking a huge range. there was a real nervousness from the White House earlier on in the war that if Ukraine were gifted these very sophisticated weapons, that they might take the fight to a much greater degree than we think they have done into Russia itself. We think some of these small raids, some of these small events that have been happening in Russia are probably either air assault raids or special forces raids, or we're not entirely sure. But there was a nervousness that with these bigger weapons that Ukraine might take the fight into Russia, and that would be an escalatory step too far and would be seen as too provocative, that the West had enabled them to been too enabling, and there was a worry that would drag the West and NATO in particular and the US into direct confrontation with Russia. I think there's been a willingness from the West to help when we've seen what's happened in country, and we've seen the atrocities in Bucha and elsewhere. There's been a greater willingness to help. I think Ukraine have also shown that they are not just going to go and grab this stuff and start trying to bomb places in Russia. So that also has helped sort of mollify some concerns. And I think the USR and the Western contributing nations more broadly are coming around to the conclusion that we can safely gift and train Ukrainians in this equipment, these natures of equipments, without them rushing off to try and bomb Belgorod and goodness knows what else. So I think in the next package we're likely to see these multiple launch rocket systems gifted, and that will help to push back. That will target the Russian artillery that at the moment is pulverizing Ukrainian towns and villages, such that the tanks and the infantry that follow up thereafter just are sort of walking behind this carpet of artillery. So if you're able to push that back, or even better, sort of destroy those artillery pieces in place, then that will assist in the defence and any possible counter-offensive. But it's a question of range and precision. You've got to be able to reach as far as you can, and you've got to be able to hit the thing you're after, because they're fairly robust, these pieces of equipment. So you only need a round landing just tens of meters away is not going to have any effect on it. You've got to be very, very close, or preferably a direct hit, to really destroy these things. So precision is the name of the game, and precision at range is what you're really after.
Brilliant. Well, Mutaz and Dom, can I have your final thoughts? Just looking ahead over the next few days, over the weekend, what should we be paying attention to?
Yeah, just as a sort of a broad thought, we will have an editorial tomorrow morning on the need for Britain to do more, and the Western world to do more to support Ukraine. This is a crunch moment, and it's a time for renewed sort of commitment. But it is worrying that Russian leverage is increasing seemingly across the board, right? We're talking about how they're now targeting a much smaller bit of territory in Ukraine because of previous failures on the battlefield. But they might be able to squeak out a small victory from that. But if you look at sort of the international picture, there was this sense at the start of the war that when Putin warned of starvation and economic calamity, there was a sense in the West that this stuff could be averted, that it was an exaggeration by the Kremlin, and the West could handle a war in Ukraine. Economically, we could sort of, the reduction in exports of foodstuffs from Ukraine, wheat and so on, can be sort of replaced by an increase in exports from countries like India, when in fact we've seen lots of food nationalism from these countries, and not much of an increase to replace it. There's an assumption that a reduction in gas exports, could be mitigated by more LNG gas from America and so on. Now we're seeing just how difficult it is, not just to build these LNG terminals and how long it takes to build these LNG terminals in countries like Germany, but a reluctance even in America for climate reasons and so on to export vast amounts of it. There was an assumption that any sort of oil shock could be mitigated. Well, oil prices are likely going to increase a hell of a lot over the coming months, which increases revenues for Russia. And the consequences of this, well, we're facing the prospect of famine across the third world in countries like Somalia. That leads to an increase in migration. We're talking about figures like 100,000 asylum seekers and migrants crossing the English Channel every year. For the UK domestically, that is intolerable for our domestic politicians. It will lead to I can tell you, it will lead to a major backlash. We're talking about inflation hitting 10% or so, and the government having to spend 15 billion, 30 billion pounds, just to keep families keep families from freezing, frankly, in their homes. The situation is becoming intolerable for Western nations, and that increases Putin's leverage. So we've gone from Putin is losing and he has lost, and Ukraine shows just how strong and mighty the West is, to now this is the real test, right? This is the real test, and whether or not we can withstand a few more months of this, is very questionable. It's very questionable. Just in terms of UK politics, things are looking very shaky at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Mutaz, for that view, that rather more sober view inside the mind of the British establishment. Dom Nicholls, would you like the final words before the weekend?
Thank you. I'm afraid I will continue Mutaz's sobriety. I think this is the real test. He talks of a food and oil shock. Well, yes, we're about to have a reality shock if events go as we think and as we've predicted in the Severodonetsk pocket. Then yes, then we will be facing the West. Or many people in the West will be faced with what? Oh, hang on! I thought this was all over. I thought Ukraine were doing really well, and it was going to be over by the summer. I think this will be the moment where we find out really who's in this for the long haul, and decisions over what is escalatory, what natures of equipment is deemed too provocative, will come to the fore. We will then have a look at how much money and humanitarian aid countries are willing to offer for all the reasons Mutaz has just outlined. And I think we will have a moment of reckoning. President Zelensky, as I said earlier, he and his team have been sort of preparing domestic society, international community for this moment. But I think we are going to be invited to have a good look in the mirror and say, right, well, who are you? Are you up for this fight, this battle of values? And I think, as Mutaz says, we're about to enter the real test.
On this podcast, we've been keen to explore the ways in which ordinary Ukrainians have responded to the conflict, discovering the ingenious and sometimes surprising ways in which people have put their talents and passions towards supporting their armed forces and humanitarian efforts. But for this next interview, I must confess a personal interest. My father's family live on the island of Islay in the west of Scotland. Right now, it's difficult to imagine anywhere further away from the war in Ukraine. Islay is famous for whisky. Numerous distilleries dot the island. Their household names, Lefroy, Ardbeg, Lagavulin, Bruichladdich, the list goes on. So when I saw in the Eluk, the local newspaper of the island, that a team of Ukrainians were launching 2 new whiskies at the upcoming festival, Fèis Ile, I knew I had to get in touch. I wanted to understand how a special bottle of whisky sold at the other end of Europe could impact Ukraine's war effort. So I spoke to Alex Ostrovskyy, head of whisky at the Whisky Corner restaurant in Kyiv. He explained the story of the special bottlings and took me through how the money spent in the West was used to buy equipment for the army fighting in Ukraine.
My whiskey journey starts in 2006, I think. I tried Lagavulin 16, and it was for me something unusual, which is not can be compared with other alcohol. So that's why medicine, oily, peaty, and these flavors for me was very interesting. And it was first whiskey. And then I tried to explore, find another similar peaty whiskey, and in a couple of years I visit Scotland. And from this moment, whiskey became my hobby. I started collecting bottles. Maybe one of the first, my collection was Dallas Dew, or first Octomore, first releases of Octomore. So
the Octomore's the Bruichladdich, isn't it? Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, so but first October it was, I think, 2009. It was released in 2009. So it was the beginning, and then I was invited to join Whisky Corner restaurant as the head of whiskey tasks, a different whiskey tasks which connected with whiskey. And it was some of like dreams to make bottlings, which private bottlings. So that's why we start to find opportunities, how to learn how to do it. And from 2012 till this year, I think it was made around 40 different releases.
Oh, wow.
So during these 10 years, we learned how to choose cask, how to bottle, how to label, and how to create whiskey.
So let's talk about 2022. You're the head of whiskey at Whisky Corner. It's a very, it looks, I've seen the pictures, it looks absolutely beautiful house restaurant in central Kyiv. With whiskey bottles all down one wall, lots of polished wood, and everybody's in black ties. Looks very fancy. How did the war impact you and your business?
Everything closed, and maybe just right now, after 3 months, the Kyiv, because restaurant located in Kyiv, come back to new life. It can be named as previous life because it's a new life. And I think most restaurants are still closed because this time, I think not the restaurant time, but small steps we're trying to return to life. And that's why, as I told you in the previous program, that I will bring my mom back to Kyiv, because I think now it's more safer, and so I can bring her back to her flat, and that's why, and that's all, because I don't know, do you know the time scale of what is going on in Kyiv, but in March it was very dangerous because Russian troops were around the Kyiv. They were very close, and it was real war around Kyiv, but now it's gone.
So I don't know if our listeners might be able to hear this bird song in the background of your recording, which is very nice, because you're speaking from a village, I think you said south of Kyiv, yeah.
Unfortunately, I cannot ask them to be.
It's fine.
To be. I bring my mom here because it was on south. It was the opposite direction from Russian troops to come, because they come from north and from the northwest. So I moved here.
So let's talk about the Whisky Festival. So you've been bottling special whiskies to raise money for the Ukrainian armed forces. You know, we spoke to a comedian who was doing stand-up sets in Kyiv, and he said, comedy was his weapon. And so for you, is your skill with whiskey and your love of whiskey, that's something you're using to support your army?
Yeah, it's true, because you must understand that in March, and now we're living in our social area, social news, local discussion, and one of the good sign which I hear there from my wife, from my friends, that so everyone must do something that he can do good. So that's why. So I understand that. So we can do bottling. We understand it how to do, and it's funny, but thank you for COVID. We understand how to do it remote, because 2 years before we work with Scotland remote, and it works. So us or me on Scotland physically, so I can write emails, I can organize bottling, labeling, any transport movements. It was just one thing which worried. We have like a little bit more than 1 month to do everything, to move to bottling hall, to make labels, to label, then prepare to dispatch and deliver to Germany. So And so the whiskey was in Germany, I think, 2 days before festival. But the key solution was that I'm asked a lot of people to help, and we take most faster delivery, which brings like in 1 day to Germany. And so I would like to say thank you for all people in Scotland, because they help us very much.
It's interesting how the UK is obviously supporting Ukraine a lot in all sorts of different ways. And this is a new and a different aspect to that support is through whiskey and the power of whiskey.
But I would like to say again big thank you for everyone, because to produce these 2 bottles you have to join and connect a lot of people, and it's really production. So that's why every people in the bottling home and print company and transport company tries to help and do best, because everyone understands that the importance of what we're doing, and understands that we have to bring this whiskey to festival, because this is a huge festival. It's around 5,000 guests there, so we understand that. So it's one of the best opportunities to present our whiskey and raise money for charity. So
and where does the money go exactly? So it's the armed forces and other charities, or?
Yeah, so we split armed forces today. Ordered 100 it's gift certificates for children's. It will be announced in this Saturday. It's like it's a certificate for food. It's a gift certificate from one wide Ukrainian chain of supermarkets, and we will give these certificates to children, which it's children of some Ukrainian army men, or maybe it's orphans.
Orphans, yeah.
Or orphans. Saturday it will be presented for these kids, and we will make like a report on Facebook. But before we bought drones and image and thermal imagers for army.
Oh wow!
Because it's expensive, but it was a lot of requests for this equipment.
So just so I understand this clearly, because I hadn't really realised that. I'd have assumed that the money you raised would just sort of go to the army, and you wouldn't necessarily know, where it was spent or what was it spent on. But you're saying people. You've bottled this special whiskey. You're presenting it at the Festival next week, and you've shown it off already in Germany. People buying that whiskey, the money goes to you. The army and the irregular army and the regular army have said, we want drones, we want XYZ equipment. Then that you spend that money on that equipment and hand it over. So there's a direct link. You know exactly the money spent by somebody at the festival and where that goes. Wow.
Yeah, so I just trying to explain you. So we have in general here two waves how to support, 2 vectors. So first of all, it's mentioned on the back label of our bottling. So we have accounts and National Bank of Ukraine, 2 accounts. One of these accounts is to support army, and another account it's to support humanitarian organizations, to help civil people, and this is one of the ways. So you just can transfer money. It's one of the decisions. Another decision it's to help direct to some army battalions, some army groups, or some volunteers organization which already exist. And because unfortunately now we have a big war, but the small conflicts and small war began 8 years ago. We had charity organization before, but now it's different situation, and we have full and a big war which is around.
I guess.
So
sorry.
And I can explain you the difference of these 2 waves. So the first wave, you just transfer money, and the big organization trying to organize, split this money, move this money to buy some equipment. And so it's also good, but it's a long story. Other story which we explained you before, to help direct to this organization or buy this equipment. Maybe it's a small task, but it's more effective according to time. Because, for example, drones and thermal imager I bought by myself. So I bought by myself, moved to warehouse in Poland, and then same volunteers as me import this equipment to Ukraine, and then I forward this to men from army which I know personal. So it's just to explain it, it's not good or bad. It's just two different ways which you can do it and you can help.
And your whiskey will be doing both. Some of it will be going into the central pot. Some will be going on individual items. Yeah. What's the atmosphere like amongst you and your friends? What are your feelings about the war?
It's strange feelings because I don't wish anyone to get these feelings, because your mind changed every day. So because you don't feel safe at any place, but it was like in March. But now after 2 months, the situation the same, because we don't have Russian troops here, but we have missile attacks with danger every day, and because these warnings about missile attacks I receive on my phone, I think 5 times a day, every day. But your mind is changed. So now it's for you, it's not like so scare as 1 month before. So missile attacks became common, and Kyiv not most the danger city in Ukraine, because if you compare to Mariupol, if you compare to eastern cities, this war border and the war activities is closer. So it's difficult to say about feelings. So because they change, but we have just one feeling, that we have to continue protect our homes, continue fight, and continue be Ukrainians, because it's our homes.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Sophie Coe.